Well, recently I met Mark Wilkie, who's a South African living in Taiwan. And Mark's been listening to our series, Fighting Men of Rhodesia. And he's a very interesting guy. He's doing his PhD in military history, but I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that, specifically covering wartime atrocities in Taiwan. And coupled with that, another one of my subscribers, who's one of my best supporters, mentioned to me that it would be very interesting if we could interview military veterans like Vietnam vets, etc., who are living in the Philippines. And Mark and I were just talking about it because we both are in the same time zone. He's in Taiwan, I'm in the Philippines, so in between us is the South China Sea. And we were, he was saying there's quite a big South African community in Taiwan, and we just decided we thought it might be a great idea for us to start a new series, a playlist, if you will, whereby we interview Southern Africans, and I say Southern Africans because they may be Namibians, they may be Zambians, they may be Rhodesians, they may be South African SADF guys, or Portuguese guys who had been living in Angola or Mozambique, and who are veterans of the conflicts that occurred in Southern Africa, and are now living in Southeast Asia or in Asia. And so, kicking off that series today, I wanted to introduce you to Mark. We've become good friends. I think he's a natural storyteller, and he's very enthusiastic about his subject. And Mark, I'm really looking forward to what you have to tell us. Perhaps you should just start off by telling us a little bit about your background, where you come from, how you ended up in the SADF, and what finally brought you to where you are now, because I think it's all relevant to the future of this series.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, I was born in Durban, and we moved to Cape Town when I was about 9 or 10 months old, and so my early life was basically all in Pinelands in Cape Town,
Right.
and I went to Pinelands Primary School, and then later we moved up to Johannesburg. I did my national service in the late 80s. So when I was a kid, I remember it was my aunt and uncle lived up in Rhodesia, and I can remember my uncle coming to visit me in Cape Town. I was a little kid, and he brought me some like FN cartridges and some AK. I mean, actually just the Doppies, and some AK-47 ones from the Rhodesian Bush War. And I was like, wow, this is quite something. And then in the late 70s, um, I think Rhodesian kids started arriving at our schools, and so kind of late 70s through the 80s. Typically, it's an English South African school class, you would have you'd probably be one or two Rhodesian kids. You'd probably have one or two Portuguese kids, that had come down from Mozambique or Angola. Um, Typically, maybe an Italian or two whose fathers or grandfathers had been POWs in South Africa, and the family had decided to settle there, and so a few maybe Greek Cypriots or Greeks, things like that.
Mm.
And so I remember when we moved up to Johannesburg. Now I was the new kid in the class, and the other new kid was a guy by the name of Douglas Keel, and he was from Rhodesia. So we were the two. So there was always that connection. There was always, growing up, you always were with people that had come from Rhodesia. You knew about it. I think so many South African families had relatives in Rhodesia. So it was something that we were very much aware of. Then, I mean, in South Africa, we had national service. So as soon as I turned, as soon as I finished high school, well, in my matric year, you get your call ups.
Yeah.
And maybe let me step back one moment here. I was
Actually, Mark, let me
yeah,
just interrupt you there. Sorry, I don't want to break your train of thought, but um, just a comment. A little town where I grew up in Chipinga in Rhodesia. The phone book was was like pages and pages of Jabez, Odendals, and Buertas,
yeah,
and the amount of English names was actually quite small, and and then there's guys like me, Van Sale, but I
yeah,
think about a lot of the almost half the names, maybe even more than half the names of the Rhodesians in the Rhodesian War, and in the various fighting units were, people like Krookamp and Wessels and Steenkamp
yeah,
and um, a lot of South African. So in a way, half the Rhodesians came from, were Van Tonders and people like that with South African backgrounds, and so you know, it's no wonder that a lot of our subscribers who watch Fighting Men of Rhodesia are from South Africa and are former SADF vets, and certainly at a lot of our RLI gatherings and our veterans getting together for memorial services and everything, a lot. At least a third of the people there are SADF vets, even though
yeah,
we may not be honoring the SADF in particular, unless it's, of course, something like the downing of Puma 164, where the pilot and the tech and that there was a South African flight crew,
yeah,
who were
yeah,
killed in Puma 164, and there you would get the South African Air Force coming and laying a wreath and everything, but otherwise the South African guys at Fort Ikapa and the Canopy Club used to invite us, because we were also airborne infantry, to their briars, and and
yeah,
so there's a definite brotherhood amongst the veterans. When we march on November the 11th at the War Memorial, you'll find the 3-2 battalion guys will march next to the RLI guys, and so yeah, there is definitely that sense of brotherhood, and so it makes sense for us to touch on the South African thing, I think. Anyway, that's my
yeah,
2 cents with you.
yeah.
Sorry to
Because I mean,
interrupt.
even in World War II, I mean, some of the Rhodesian units were in the South African divisions.
Yeah,
Yeah,
correct.
so there's like that, definitely that overlap. And
Yeah,
I remember when I was doing my national service, I mean, we had a sergeant major that was ex Rhodesian SAS, and then I'm just trying to think, at the Transvaal Scottish, one of our I guess he was the W02. He was the warrant officer second class. He was the quartermaster. He was South African, but he had gone up to Rhodesia. I guess this was still in the days of the Federation. As a youngster, and he had served BSAP, and then later Rhodesia Regiment, and then he'd then gone back to South Africa, and he had fought in what's it that's 1975. When they went up into Angola, up Savannah, he was in that, and then he seemed to go back to Rhodesia. I guess towards the late 70s, and then back to South Africa, and so there was a lot of
mm,
there was a lot of movement between the two. And you
yeah,
would often find I mean, the first company that I worked for, it was basically Rhodesian, like former Rhodesian owned. And yeah, like quite a lot of the guys, they were like, this one was born in South Africa, had gone up to Rhodesia as a kid. Others had just, you know, as they kind of hit adulthood, moved up to Rhodesia. They were living up there. They'd even gone up, northern Rhodesia, that kind of thing. And yeah, so there's certainly a lot of that kind of connection.
mm, mm,
At school, I guess you guys used to have to do it as well, cadets. Yeah. And so standard 8, what would that be? Form 3. I was sent on a cadet platoon sergeant's course. They sent us to an infantry camp. It was pretty hardcore. those like those infantry instructors were like cadets. They went out of their way to make our life a misery, kind of thing. But anyway, when I was on the cadet camp, I kind of saw hey, there's medics there. Medics. We all suffering and things, but those medics, at night they get to sleep in their ambulances, and nobody messes with them, and that actually looks pretty good. And then came came back, and I can remember like probably in standard nine. I guess I would have been standard nine, speaking to my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, and he said to me, like if you can get into, you don't want to be cannon fodder, get into something that that might teach you something and things like that. So what I did was, basically national service, you didn't really have much of a say in where you were going. But I heard that you could write to, it was the military. And I still remember the address was Grote Kerk in Pretoria.
Okay.
And you could request, a particular, place that you wanted to go to. But that, everybody said to me, "You're wasting your time." And I said, "Okay, I'm gonna write." And what I did was I wrote this letter, and I said it was a family tradition that we serve in the medics, which was actually only half true, because my great uncle by marriage, during he was a professor of medicine, and at the beginning of World War II, he had gone into the medics. And because he was like a very prominent doctor, he actually landed up as what they called the Adjutant Director of Medical Services, which was was the Deputy Surgeon General. And so, I mean, my one grandfather was in the engineers and the other one was in the artillery. But I put in there, that I said, Colonel Steer was my uncle and all of this kind of stuff. And I remember I was visiting my grandfather one day during matric, and my father phoned me and he said, "There's a brown envelope here for you." And I mean, my father had been in the SAF, so he knew exactly what it was. He said, "It's your call-ups. Do you want me to open them?" And so I said, like, "Yeah, okay." And then he just exclaimed something. I can't remember exactly, but as he said that, I either thought it's either very good or very bad. And he says to me, "I don't know how you got this right." And so I said, "Where am I going? Where is it?" And he said, "No, you're going to the medics." And so whether the letter actually worked or whether it was sheer fluke, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's where I got my call-ups to. So I went into the medics, did my national service in the medics, mostly I did most of my time at what was the medics. We got SAMS, South African Medical Services, SAMS College, mostly in support of training. We did several transport duties in the townships, and we also they used to nail us for kind of VIP protection, like uniformed.
Okay.
When they were having big functions with generals and politicians, they would often send us as like the uniformed guards to these things. So that was quite interesting. Then after national service, we still had camps. So
Yeah.
I was posted to one medical battalion in Durban. I landed up basically doing all my camps on detached duty back at
Yeah.
Sam's College. Camps, so camps, I landed up one medical battalion, and then post 94, kind of everything petered out. And during that time, I met a guy by the name of Mike Else. And Mike Else was the RSM of the Transvaal Scottish. And Mike started working on me and saying, "Hey, you need to come and join us." And actually, my paternal grandfather had been in the Transvaal Scottish. He had joined up in, I think it was like 1927. and he had been in the Transvaal Scottish up until 1940. But when they mobilized in 1940, because he was a mining surveyor, that was considered a protected profession, and he wasn't allowed to go overseas. So what he did was he transferred to the mining engineering battalion in the South African Engineers. And then in late 41, um, they needed tunnelers in Lebanon. And Churchill asked Smuts if they could get miners because they needed to punch through these mountains in Lebanon very as quickly as possible to construct a railway, because they were bringing the supplies from like Syria, and then they'd be on the railway until they'd hit Lebanon and they'd get the mountains, and then they had to truck everything over the mountains, load it back on trucks. I mean, load it back on the train, and then they would send it into, across into Egypt. And so suddenly they asked for volunteers on the mines. And so my grandfather immediately joined up. And then that's how he got to go overseas. So, yeah, he went with, I think it was 61 tunneling company.
Yeah.
And so with my grandfather had been in the Transvaal Scottish from 27 to 40, and then I also had a great uncle in World War One that was in the Transvaal Scottish. Yeah, eventually I kind of relented, and I joined up, and I then did a bit of time in the Transvaal Scottish. Then 2003, I decided to come to Taiwan. Well, that was like right at the beginning of 2003.
Sure.
And at that
20 years ago.
20 years ago,
Yeah.
I think I needed a break from South Africa. I was working in risk management and security and things like that. And it was getting pretty hectic. And I just really felt it was more, I'd like to get out of South Africa. Not at that time, it wasn't like I wanted to go permanently. It was just I really wanted to do some traveling and have a break. And I had a friend that was in Taiwan, and so I decided. So I went out to Taiwan and I started teaching, and I enjoyed the place. And then I decided, okay, I don't want to teach kids forever. And I started working I started doing film work, mostly with National Geographic. And then I decided to do my master's degree in education. And then after that, then I started lecturing in university and, teaching media and that type of thing. And then in 2003, I'd found out about the prisoners of war in Taiwan, all the Allied prisoners of war, and I got involved with that. And then later I decided, okay, I'd like to do my PhD, and I'd like to do it in kind of the what we'd say like social memory or war memory, basically how Taiwan remembers World War II, and specifically the memories of the Allied prisoners of war held on Taiwan. And so that's how that came about. With the POWs in 2003, I heard that there had been POWs, and at that time I heard that there was a Canadian guy, expat, that was kind of doing stuff with the POWs, and I contacted him and I hooked up with him, and there was a society that he had founded in 1997. I think in 1996 he had heard the story of a very notorious POW camp called Kinkaseki, which is kind of not too far from Taipei, up in the mountains. It was a copper mine, and it was one of the most brutal POW camps. And he had heard the story of this, and then he had decided that he'd like to get a project going and get a memorial built. And so he put together a committee, and they started working on things. And at that time, McGill Alexander, who was a colonel, Colonel McGill Alexander, was the South African military attaché to Taiwan.
Yes.
And McGill Alexander was a supporter of that project.
Wow.
And
I actually knew McGill Alexander. Isn't that the small world?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, at that time, nobody knew that there were any South Africans that had been POWs here. It was mostly British. The biggest group had been British. Then there were some Australians, some Dutch, and Americans. And when I got involved, I asked, were there any South Africans? No South Africans. I kind of thought, South Africans always crawl out the woodwork somewhere. Days of empire, I kind of thought it would be quite likely that there might have been a few South Africans. It was amongst the Brits at that time. It was known that there was one Kiwi and there were 3 Canadians. And some of the prisoner of war index cards, Japanese prisoner of war index cards, had just been declassified. They were in the process of slowly declassifying some of them. And so there were some that were available. And we sorted through those, and I found 2 South Africans. And so that's when I realized, okay, there were 2 South Africans held on Taiwan. The one guy was Royal Engineers, and he was from Woodstock in Cape Town. And the other guy was Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and he was from Springs on the East Rand. And the one guy had been captured in Singapore, and the other guy had been captured in Bangkok. And so that was the start. And then over the years, we found 9 South African born POWs here. And some of them were like what I would say like real South Africans. Others were just happened to be born in South Africa. But anyway, what it turned out was during let's say the 30s, maybe early 40s, kind of as it is in some ways now, people travel, people work abroad. There's that desire to go to other places, and so for like young South African engineers, young South African doctors, guys that wanted to be pilots or go into aviation and things like that, the British forces offered far greater scope than the South African forces at that time. If you were a young guy that had let's say an engineering degree, you joined the Royal Engineers, you could go anywhere and you'd be exposed to a lot of things. Also with like young medical doctors that might not have had a lot of money to be able to set themselves up in private practice. And this wasn't just for, kind of South Africans. You find this amongst the Canadians, the Australians, the Kiwis, it's like that. What would happen was these young doctors would join either the Royal Army Medical Corps or the Indian Army Medical Corps. And because you were a qualified doctor, you'd go in as a captain. If you played your cards right and you did a good job, within a few years, you'd be a major. And you'd be able to save a lot of money. You'd get a lot of experience. And then after 5 years or 10 years, you could leave and you could set yourself up. And so this type of, and there were also South Africans that had were living in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Shanghai. For instance, in Shanghai, Shanghai even had a South African club that was founded in the 1920s. And if you look at like the consulate, like they would have functions, and you'd see like there was a South African consulate, and all the like in those days, all the dominions. You'd find that the Canadians were there, the Australians were there, the New Zealanders were there, and I suppose there was a lot of interaction between the people of the the different dominions, and Shanghai, there were a lot of like South African teachers, bankers, businessmen, legal professionals, things like that. And then when the war broke out within Japan, you know, these people either had to join local volunteer military, like kind of militias, either in Hong Kong, Singapore, places like that, in Shanghai, as well. And then people would get, then the Japanese took over. If you were in the militia, you'd become a prisoner of war. If you were a civilian, you'd be an enemy alien, and they'd return you. And so, from the work that I've done, about looking at like over 200 South Africans landed up as prisoners of war of the Japanese. Probably about 50 of them civilian, and the rest military.
In Taiwan,
and not in. This is across Asia, kind of Singapore,
like Changi Prison and places
Changi,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And with Taiwan was a Japanese colony. It had become a Japanese colony in 1895. So by, let's say, early 1942, Taiwan had been a Japanese colony for 47 years. So it was very Japanese. And Taiwan was deep inside in early 42. Taiwan was deep inside, kind of Japanese territory. It was far away from the fighting. And the attack on the Philippines was mostly launched from Taiwan. The invasion of Malaya was a lot of the planning took place on Taiwan, and then the force moved off to Hainan, and then from there they launched towards Thailand and things like that. And so Taiwan was now deep inside Japanese territory, and the Japanese decided that they were going to move the highest ranking POWs, like General Wainwright from the Philippines, Percival that was captured in Singapore. So basically, all your colonels, brigadiers, and generals, and if it was the Navy, your admirals and commodores, etc., they were going to move them to Taiwan, and they were going to keep the highest ranking POWs here, as well as the like governors of colonies, the chief justices, your highest civilian officials as well. They were all sent to Taiwan. And then they also brought in quite a bit of rank and file as well, to workers like slave labor in the mines and the sugar plantations and things like that. So Taiwan was very important for POWs. And there was some rather nasty camps here. And that's, I was involved with remembering the POWs, and I got very involved with the society. Now I'm the deputy director of the society, and we've cooperated with diplomatic missions of various allied nations, former allied nations like the Americans, the Brits, the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Dutch, as well as the authorities here. And we have, starting in 97, they've had Remembrance Day each November, kind of November 11th. There's a whole Remembrance Park, or POW Memorial Park, constructed up on the site of the old Kinkaseki POW camp. Has quite a unique memorial. The name of every single POW held on Taiwan is on the memorial, and their nationalities as well. And then several of the other camps, the locations have got memorials. And up until, well, let's say particularly up until about 2010, you'd get a lot of former POWs coming back for Remembrance Day. And they would make kind of like a Remembrance Week out of it. They would come to Taiwan and they'd do the Remembrance Day thing, and then they might go off to the other camps during the week. And so I got to know quite a few of the former POWs and also their families. All the POWs have now passed on, but we're still in contact with the families. And remembering, with contact with the families and things like that, one would tell them, okay, I'm going to such and such a memorial. Would you like me to, put anything at the memorial on your behalf or anything like that? And informally, several of our it was mostly South African vets, but it also involved a Kiwi vet as well. We were like informally going out to the memorials and cleaning them, and we do remembrance dedications for any family members that wanted that done. And that kind of was one of the big driving factors in trying to establish a South African veterans, something for South African veterans on Taiwan. And so we were looking at various things, and it took a while. It was, we until eventually I thought, okay, let's try to do something. And I wasn't really sure who to go to, who to ask. But anyway, I knew Jaco Steenberg from SATFA. And I said to him, what do you think of this idea? And Jaco was, no, I think that's a great idea. And so Jaco immediately started kind of working on our behalf, saying, hey, there's a bunch of South African veterans in Taiwan, and they keen on making a branch or a unit. And so I ended up writing a proposal, and the South African Defence Force Association, SATFA, they accepted it and said, yeah, they think that that's a good idea, and they supported us. And then we, earlier this year, we established our SATFA's first international post. And then we spoke to them more, and we actually have set up now an entire international division, which we're working on. But Taiwan's the first official post that's up and running. And basically what we do is, the first thing is that it's a bunch of vets. You get to, there's that camaraderie. You can speak to each other. There's people that have experienced similar things to you.
Yeah,
that's the first thing. So very much the fellowship. Also, what we saw with what SATFA was doing was, SATFA is a fully registered, functioning organization in South Africa, veterans organization. And we saw that they were trying to do a lot on behalf of veterans in South Africa. And we liked what they were doing. And we thought, okay, we would like to support that as well. And the other thing was, here we, the mandate that they gave us was to, remember the fallen out here. And when you look at it, there were the POWs, a few South African POWs. Then the Korean War, there was 2 squadrons SAF in Korea, and something else that's altogether overlooked was the involvement of the members of the South African Navy. In those days, it was the South African Naval Forces, the SANF. They were active in the Pacific, and there were in late March 1945, the British Pacific Fleet came up from Australia, and that was Task Force 57, and their job was to act as a wedge between Taiwan and Okinawa during the invasion of Okinawa. So the Americans would attack Okinawa, and the British Pacific Fleet would come into the area between Okinawa and Taiwan, because there's several of the Ryukyu Islands are there. And because Taiwan was such an important Japanese, it's a military area, and Okinawa is not that far from Taiwan. Okinawa is closer to Taiwan than it is to the the bottom, kind of like Kagoshima, and at the bottom of the Japanese home islands. And so what they wanted was that the British Pacific Fleet would attack the airfields in the Ryukyus around off Formosa, as well as the airfields in northern Taiwan. And in the British Pacific Fleet, there were a number of South African Navy pilots flying for the Fleet Air Arm. And also, with one of the things that in South Africa that they did during the war was Cape Town and Durban were major centers for the fitting and supplying of Allied ships. They would come in and they'd refurbish them, they'd fit them and things like that. And part of the agreement was, if they were short of manpower, that the South African Navy would provide them with manpower. And so all of these ships had little contingents of South Africans on it, even though they were British ships. Actually, it wasn't only Royal Navy ships; it was also Australian and New Zealand. And so you'd find like let's say like a ship like the Illustrious, the aircraft carrier. Illustrious had like a little contingent of 11 South Africans on it. Some ships would have one or two. There was also certain some officers in South African naval officers received specialist training, let's say, in things like radar and things like that, and then they'd be put onto various Commonwealth ships as specialists. And so in Operation Iceberg, which was basically the invasion of Okinawa, about 100 South African sailors and a few airmen took part in the Battle of Okinawa. And, all of this is not really known. And so, and it starts in 1944 with the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean and going into Southeast Asia. And so there's all of these operations involving first the Eastern Fleet and then the British Pacific Fleet that had South Africans. And by 1945, there were over 2,000 South Africans serving in South African Navy guys serving in the Far East. And then also there was the South African Merchant Navy and merchantmen. And when you look at South African merchantmen that got the Pacific Star, they were serving on the oilers and ships like that. It's not just white South Africans. You see surnames like Zwane, Pillay, Mudli. So it's black South Africans, colored South Africans, Indian South Africans, even some Chinese South Africans. And so this is what we've been doing a lot, is making people aware here that when they have remembrance functions, because it's not only it's not only for the POWs, because there was a big air war over Taiwan. We kind of like, hey, us South Africans were here too, and we've been doing a lot of that type of thing, and that's basically what we've been trying to achieve here. I think there's incredibly rich history here, and South Africa has played a part in that. And if you go back even to the early days with Burma, in 1942, early 42, there was the American Flying Tigers, American, the volunteer force, and they were doing fighter escort duties for the RAF squadrons, the Blenheim bombers. And for instance, it was 113 squadron, 113 squadron, RAF. That squadron, the squadron leader was Rhodesian from Plumtree, and there were a whole lot of seconded South African, SAF pilots flying in the squadron. And these are things that nobody hears about. Um, and then there's some amazing stories here of, like, I mean, even in the Battle of Okinawa, two South African Navy pilots been shot down. And one had like a real dramatic rescue, snatched from the jaws of the Japanese in one of those walruses flew in, and the other guy was rescued by an American sub. And so there's some really amazing stories. And there certainly were a lot of atrocities out here, but there was also this, like, I suppose, like, kind of a triumph of the spirit. And if you look at, I mean, I don't know if you remember the film in the 80s, Empire of the Sun,
Yes.
about that little kid.
Yeah.
I think Christian Bale played the part.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I'll never forget the Japanese commander saying to him, "You difficult boy."
Yeah. Now, I mean, that all took place in, that was in Shanghai. But the reality is that there are probably, I know of at least 8 South African kids that probably had a pretty similar experience. And all of this is stuff that is totally off. It's totally off the radar.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of history that one would like to look at and talk about,
explore. Yeah.
And there's I mean, all of those, starting in 44, all of those naval campaigns of the Eastern Fleet, and then later the British Pacific Fleet, each one of those, like Operation Crimson and Operation Banquet, and all of those, they all had South African personnel in them. And then, I was just recently, we were, there was September 2nd was the anniversary of the signing of the surrender in Tokyo Bay. And I'd read one thing where they talk about Commander Cartwright, who was the South African representative there. And the one article says he was the only South African there. Then another article names 5 South Africans that were there. And what I did, I mean, was over, in recent times, a lot more stuff's become available.
Yes.
So it's not like people did bad work back in the day. It was just that simply the records weren't available. A lot of them were classified. And so I have copies.
Could I just add a quick little anecdotal story there? Very interesting story. I have an interest in Japanese sword fighting.
Yeah.
And I was in Durban one day, and there was a pawn shop kind of selling used, stuff. And amongst all the fishing rods and guitars and CD players or whatever, there was a Japanese sword in Shingunto mountings, which is Japanese military mountings. And the military mountings were interesting in that sense that they were obviously a higher ranking official. And gosh, it's going back in time now, but I remember that with the sword, there was a letter, because I bought the sword. I think I paid the princely sum of 200 Rand for this Shingunto sword, which was a folded blade with a differentially tempered, and had actually been a family blade made in the 1600s, round about the Battle of Sekigahara. Well, it wasn't a particularly valuable blade. I remember the temper line was Sanbon Sugi, which was the Kanehiro family of Mino province, were the swordsmiths that made this sword. But the letter that accompanied the sword, so it obviously was a family blade that had been put into military mountings. It wasn't one of those mass-produced, oil-quenched Shingunto swords. And the sword had been surrendered to a South African guy on board that ship. Was it the USS Missouri? In September 1945, when the Japanese forces surrendered to General MacArthur. So I had that sword for many, many years, and I think I eventually sold it for 30,000 Rand. Also at a pawn shop, but I got a much better price for it because I'd done more homework on the provenance of it, but just an interesting side story. Yeah.
Yeah. Phew. Yeah, I mean, there must be a tremendous amount of stuff that's out there that is, that was picked up and brought back and things like that. I mean, I've seen some of those, those like good luck flags. And
Yes.
yeah, if you start translating the stuff on them,
Those are the ones
it's
with all the signatures on them.
yeah, signatures and little good luck messages and
Yeah.
things like that. And some of them are, man, it's moving, because you realize how, in some ways, how human some of these guys are,
Yeah.
where they're clearly like conscripts and they're from some village. I remember reading one of the flags, and there's a guy that worked in a furniture shop, and it was like from all the people in the furniture shop, and yeah, it was kind of like, yeah, and so there was, with, let's say, with posting records now, a lot more stuff is available. Um, for September 2nd, I started going through the actual British Pacific Fleet vessels that were in Tokyo Bay for the surrender, comparing them against secondman records from the South African Navy. And, look, there might be a slight error here and there, but according to those records, when you put the two together, I came up with 33 guys.
Sure.
And it's quite probable.
Yeah.
When you look at the numbers of South Africans on quite a lot of the ships, some of them it's like 30, others there's 60s. There were a couple of Royal Navy ships that were entirely crewed by South Africans,
Sure. Yeah.
and so it's these things happened, and they
Mark,
were
sort of wrapping up.
yeah
Recently I interviewed Major Johan Fritz, who
yeah
is a South African vet living in Taiwan, and one of your compatriots. Thank you for the introduction. But do you see this little series that we're starting today, maybe exploring more stories like that?
yeah
Yeah.
I'd say definitely. You know, Johan would be, that was a starting point. And I think that there's a lot of, South African vets living in Taiwan and elsewhere that have stories. And, those stories should be recorded. Guys are, when in the early days in Taiwan, I was friendly with quite a few Vietnam vets, and there was even a Korean War vet, American guy that I was quite friendly with, and all of those guys have passed on now. There's still a couple of Vietnam vets here, but all of those guys have gone. And in the early 2000s, we didn't have you didn't have the phones and things like that where you could just, smartphone where you could just record something and things like that. And so much of that's all gone, and it's been lost. And it's important to record these
Absolutely.
things. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
mean,
well, thank you very much for your time, Mark. I I agree with you. I think we're all, well, particularly the Rhodesian vets, anyway. But but most of us are living in injury time, and if we don't record these stories now, we need to sort of make hay while the sun shines, and capture these stories before these veterans pass on.
yeah,
Because as I've said before, my dad had incredible stories. Unfortunately, he passed on without me recording any of them. And I can't remember them in the same detail, and I can't tell the stories the way that he told them to me.
yeah,
And so that's really the motivation I had for starting this YouTube channel in the first place, and certainly the series Fighting Men of Rhodesia. And this, to me, is I think, a great idea and a logical addition to that series, Fighting Men of Rhodesia, to explore, Southern African veterans living in the East. in
Yeah,
Asia.
definitely. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, John.
All
Thank
right.
you. Okay, mate.